Massachusetts woman. Apparently she did a conference yesterday and today. She's ahead of us all. She's the only one that sent me the paper ahead of time. I have to actually, this is something good. Yes, remarkable. You're setting a model for all of us to follow. And I can't wait to hear her paper. Practice Makes Parent, which is a lovely and interesting title. So I'll let her do the introduction of how she got interested in the topic and maybe present. I'll give everyone, since we're a small audience and we might not have to spend too much time for Q&A, maybe 20-25 minutes. If you see me going like this, it means okay?
Well, thank you, Dr. for the introduction. Thank you to the council for hosting me. I heard about this topic on a podcast actually about 2.5 years ago, and it stuck with me so much, so hard, that I had to do all the research I could to figure out more about it. So the whole of the presentation is Practice Makes Parent. It is training for motherhood with 5 babies. Bobby Domicon was one of the hundreds of babies in the first half of the 20th century who were known as practice babies. From 1919 until 1969, dozens of colleges and universities across North America temporarily adopted babies to live at their schools in practice homes during the academic year. There, female students in the home economics department lived in these practice homes for several weeks, taking turns acting out different aspects of household management, including mothering their practice babies. During each semester, Bobby Domicon, whose surname was short for domestic economy, had numerous mothers at his home in Cornell. All were watched over by the director of the school's home economics department, who some may or may not recognize as the famed home economist Martha Van Rensselaer. Babies stayed at the school for only one school year, even less if they were adopted before the term ended. But Bobby Domicon stayed at Cornell for 2 years, from 1920 to 1922. He was admitted to the school as a malnourished infant, but left as a healthy child. After their stay in practice homes, the colleges returned the children to where they had been obtained, most often an orphanage. The babies were then adopted out to families without the knowledge of the school, as was the norm for closed adoptions at the time. So far, very few people have come forward as practice babies. The whereabouts of former practice babies are largely unknown. While few official records of these babies exist, they were written about in newspapers and magazines throughout their history. Based on newspapers from the Library of Congress Chronicling American Newspaper Database, in addition to a few current articles, I traced a narrative of public opinion from the beginnings through to modern reaction. Although to many today it seems to be an incomprehensible practice, the use of practice babies had its roots in then a modern and progressive understanding of both child welfare and women's place in society. What appears to be an at best ill-conceived and at worst exploitative notion to train women for a life of home-based childcare was actually part of a larger humanistic effort to create a better world based on optimistic faith in the scientific method and the principles of the progressive era. Practice babies made sense within their contemporary context and encouraged critique as to what defines a good family and what is the right way to raise a child. The practice baby movement originated with the field of home economics, which had its roots timed firmly to the progressive era. Through science and education, the progressives believed they could make the world a better place. They regarded the home and the family as central to how society operates, so the logical place for progressive women reformers to start was in applying the scientific method to domestic life. They believed that through the application of the principles of science to everyday living, the environment would be controlled and consequently the quality of life improved. College courses in home economics strove to engender respect for their discipline, and to state definitively that traditional women's labor was real labor. If it was worth teaching, it was valuable. The progressive era's focus on science, democratization, and reform provided the perfect breeding ground for early women's rights activists to elevate the status of women. These professionalization efforts bracketed women's domestic activities as worthy of formal education, further justifying the existence of home economics as a discipline, while simultaneously promoting the idea that this work was challenging, difficult, scientific, and therefore important and worthwhile. Although not empowering in the way modern feminism might understand empowerment, By positing that women's domestic activities were worthy of formal education, they were also saying that women were valuable contributors to society through these labors and through their expertise. In a time when only 5% of the public reached high school, these degree pathways were practicable methods to further more women into higher quality education. The progressive era's focus on scientific application and efficiency naturally affected views on home life and parenting. The home economics field was developing standards for and best practices for domestic life, including child rearing. These new principles propelled the idea that mothers needed to be trained. They needed formal education in mothercraft, and practice babies were the cutting-edge, modern method. A 1924 Help Wanted ad illustrated the popularity of these ideas, displaying a desire for practicing childcare from the point of view of future mothers. A woman with 2 young adult daughters living at home placed an ad in search of a housekeeper who had a baby. The prospective chambermaid was to bring the baby with her, and while working, the 2 daughters would care for the baby. Their mother explained to her daughters have no knowledge whatever of little children or how to care for them, and are especially ignorant of the fact that a very young baby can be trained in habits and character. She wanted her daughters to practice mothering a baby before they had children of their own. This desire bred a sense of insecurity about one's natural ability to parent, and followed the contemporary thought that was put forward by the founders of home economics, that proper parenting was a skill mothers must be educated in. In the early years of practice babies, they were rarely criticized, and in fact were lauded. News coverage of these children generally remarked at how well they were cared for, writing stories only for the novelty of the situation rather than the scandal. As the East Oregonian put it, at 9 months old, the nation's youngest college professor was a baby in residence at Oregon Agricultural College, and the 5th one to hold that position. After remarking on his good fortune at being surrounded by pretty girls, the paper only stated that he will or should be an interesting character some years hence. Far from denouncing her use as a practice baby, the South Bend News-Times described baby Catherine Marie as the most carefully looked after baby in the world. This article even quoted, without opposition, Nebraska State University Chancellor Samuel Avery declaring that this practical training in motherhood is making for better babies and lower baby death rates. This was a glowing review. Out of 9 newspaper articles I found mentioning practice babies written in the first half of the 20th century, only 1 showed any reservation at all to the practice. Even this article did not mention any damage being done to the child, only that many offers of adoption are being received from women who desire to save the girl from being practiced upon by the co-eds. Every other article reported the children having plenty of love and care, with the New York Herald even describing Oregon Agricultural College's baby Alice Liu as having bloomed like a wee rose under the supervision of her practice mothers. Not until later did this practice become controversial, thus illustrated by the case of David North. At Eastern Illinois University, then Eastern Illinois State College, the Home Economics Department named the practice baby the 1953-1954 school year David North. He was the second baby the school hosted. Their first baby had been adopted by one of its practice mothers after the previous school year. David had been loaned to the school for the year by his Chicago mother in a private agreement with the director of the college's Home Economics Department, Dr. Ruth Schmalhausen. In January of 1954, a local paper wrote a story about David, which then gained national publicity. Roman L. Hransky, superintendent of Illinois Child Welfare Services, publicly criticized the use of a practice baby when he stated that the primary interest of Dr. Schmalhausen was in teaching the girls, and her secondary interest was the baby. Dr. Schmalhausen refuted this claim. But the story had already become a nationwide controversy, with popular magazines like Newsweek, Look, and Pageant all writing about David North and all heavily critical of potential psychological damage. Time magazine ran an article about David with a picture of him subtitled, "David North and Mother, Heaven Knows How Many Neuroses." Hransky ordered an investigation into the practice house after much public outcry. After several months, and after media coverage had died down, the state's investigation determined that David North could stay at the school, where he had remained all year. Dr. Schmalhausen and David North's mother had made this arrangement all on their own, and it was therefore outside the jurisdiction of the Illinois Child Welfare Services. The college returned David to his biological mother just a few weeks after the investigation was completed. Despite public outcry and state investigation, Eastern went on to temporarily adopt another baby that autumn. Amy North was the youngest resident at Eastern Illinois State College during the 1954 school year. At this point, popular understanding of child psychology and child care had undergone a definite transformation from the early years of the Practice Baby program. The highly structured, scientific method of parenting gave way to a more relaxed, Spockian attitude. Practice Baby programs were on their way out by the mid-20th century. NPR said that the last Practice Baby program ended in 1969, the same year Cornell closed its practice houses. Practice babies did not vanish because they were part of an inherently bad practice which was shut down once unearthed. The investigation at Eastern Illinois State College shows that they did not commit any crimes and the welfare of the child was not in jeopardy. They were not a secret either, with myriad news and magazine articles mentioning them. For decades, practice babies in practice homes were a valuable part of the home economics education. They went away because a larger cultural shift took place which valued an individualized, child-centric model of parenting over a regimented, one-size-fits-all approach. Practice babies went away because they were no longer thought of as the best way to learn parenting, not because there was a big expose which rocked the world of higher education and forced the closing of all the practice homes. They simply gradually disappeared as values changed. This shift was coupled with another that is perhaps more of the reason that practice babies seem so antiquated and foreign to us today. In the progressive era, home economics was a more socially acceptable route for a woman to receive an education. It was a movement founded by some of the most educated progressive women of the day. The field was an intentional movement to elevate the work of women. During the second half of the 20th century, though, this became outdated. More women were entering college in a variety of fields, and to consign them only to a domestic role was perceived as oppressive and sexist. In the early 20th century, home economics was one of the only routes for an educated woman, but as the decades passed, more opportunities for women to achieve outside the home became available. Articles written on practice babies following this shift had a much more negative tone to them. The 1954 Time article on David North was one example, which quoted director of the Women's Services Division of the United Charities, Babette Penner, as saying, "Imagine what anxieties there are in a child who is given a bottle in 12 or more pairs of arms." Lisa Grunwald, author of a fiction novel which imagined the former practice baby's adult life, wrote in 2010 for the Huffington Post, "It took quite a while before anyone wondered what damage, perhaps less physical than psychological, might be inflicted by this system of being passed around like a cheese plate." In an article for ABC News in 2011, Executive Director of the Evan B. Donaldson Adoption Institute, Adam Pertman, spoke on the horrors of practice babies, declaring that nowadays child development experts know that permanence is what matters. Looking on the bright side, thank God we learned a lesson. Unintentionally, Pertman has gotten at the heart of the issue. The scientifically correct way to raise a child is different in 2022 than it was in 1922. Attitudes toward childcare have changed, which is precisely why practice homes for practice babies no longer exist. Pertman wondered how practice babies could have ever happened, saying, on its face, the fact that we could, as a society, as educated people, think this was a good idea is quite amazing. But in the 1920s, when practice babies were first introduced and growing in popularity, it was a good idea. The options for an unwanted child, or a child whose parents were unable to take care of them, were an orphanage or some other state facility. The modern infrastructure that aims to protect children and guide them to foster homes did not exist. Children often entered practice homes malnourished and ill, but left in remarkable health. Babies raised in a practice home were also highly sought after by potential families. Multiple mothers with high caliber training would not only maintain the child's development course but improve it. This belief is only made possible by an important change that occurred during this period, a shift from a privileging of heredity, common to the eugenics movement, to a belief that the environment of a child's upbringing mattered more. The latter championed by progressive social reformers such as Jane Addams. This made a difference for adoption policies as well as what it might mean for a child to be reared by scientific mothers. Based on their contemporary beliefs, practice babies were not only logical and normal, but desirable. Just as Pertman alluded to, modern understanding of infancy underscores attachment theory, in which a permanent guardian gives a child a sense of security. When practice babies were implemented, their caregivers were also using the most modern scientific understanding at their disposal. Practice babies can be best understood when given the context out of which they arose, the application of scientific principles to motherhood in the progressive era, which highly valued both science and the centrality of mothers to society. Modern glances at the topic, which label it as dystopian, belie a fundamental misunderstanding of the era. Like everything, practice babies were a product of their day. Once they were no longer valuable, the practice faded away and gave way to other methods of childcare. Before scorning the idea of family that practice babies lived through, it is worthwhile to remember that the nuclear family as defined in post-war North America, when the practice babies largely faded away, is not the only family and certainly not the only good family that exists. Families with two parents of the same gender, with step-parents, with open adoptions, and with children who are raised by adults who are not their parents, are all homes with a great potential to have a loving and supportive environment for children to grow up in. Detractors came to prominence much later in the lifetime of practice baby programs, and once they were already fading. Early accounts of them offered no such criticism. Practice babies should not be and were not regarded as a perfect or right way to raise a child, but it is important to examine critiques of the practice. The effect that this had on children who were practice babies is largely unknown, as they could not say how they felt and there was no large follow-up study on them as they grew. However, they do make sense when placed in their appropriate temporal and cultural context. Practice babies and the large support for them encourage examination of the concepts of good and bad families. The unusual feature of this particular care arrangement is that it is the exact opposite of an orphanage, where one caretaker is responsible for several children. In the usual opposition to orphanages, a nuclear family, one or two caregivers tend to a smaller number of children. While intensive and solitary mothering currently rules the day, this is not always so, and at one time, more mothers were seen as inherently more valuable. Thank you.
And she got perfect time. This is amazing. Miracle after miracle by Rachel Cosby. Oh, sorry, Quinn. Thank you.
So our next presenter is Dr. Rachel Cosby. She's from what other pieces of dialogue might cohere that is in the French field or European history field might cohere with some of the points raised by our historians today. For Jennifer's paper, I thought this is so scary and fascinating all at once. It really just gives me goosebumps to think that people were okay with practicing. The word practicing is also quite eerie to apply to living babies, and that they had to be alive. And given the context of our current debate about women's reproductive rights and the value we give to life, quote unquote, and the debate that's happening that divides the country between quote unquote pro-life and women's rights, I think maybe I had that in the back of my mind while I was listening to Jennifer. And what are we really valuing in this context? Obviously the family unit, as Jennifer points out. And at the same time, what's the underside of this is that the baby's life is somehow seen as subordinate to, or the baby's projected growth and development as a human being is subordinated to this ideal notion of this nuclear image, family image. In the end, Jennifer does quote to us the piece, I can't remember exactly, that talks about the psychological impact this might have had on the children, because in the end, they are adopted by other families, if I understand correctly, and how that kind of upbringing and the desire to have a child who was brought up in this context, that desire also is very strange, if you come to think of it, that they would like a human being formed and shaped through a certain process that was engineered basically through this program. So I like the fact that euthenics enters into this debate. So going back to what I initially started out with, what is the value debate going on here, which looks very different from the current debate on value in the child's life. We're ready to instrumentalize a child's life for the sake of an image we'd like to project about American culture. So maybe Jennifer can speak to how she might see this transition in American historical culture of how we saw infant life and how we talk about pro-life continuum today. But just a suggestion, really it's up to you. Use this moment to extend further debate about what you think your paper brings to discussions about American culture, infants, life, etc. I'll kind of go through the different papers and maybe return to some of the connecting points if I'm able to. So Dr. Colopy's paper, for me, signaled a lot of things. She obviously comes from an educational background and she's an expert on pedagogy. So we're interested in how this can be used as public history and then how it might help us to understand and debate the structural racism issues that are coming up today is one that I take great interest in. The only thing I think for the paper she presented is, again, talking about framing. So there has been scholarship around white privilege, around the discriminatory social practices against deprivations of minorities, especially African Americans and Native Americans. And I don't know if you're familiar with Fry Jacobson's Life is in a Different Color, and there he actually talks about the gradations of whiteness that exist in immigrant culture. Even before we talk about minorities, Italians, for example, or Southern Mediterranean Europeans who arrived in the States were considered much less, they were considered actually much more inferior, I should say, to Anglo-Saxon and immigrants from the countries you pointed out, which were the very your family hailed from, the UK, Great Britain, and Germany. And so the fact that not only do the whiteness matter, but what kind of whiteness, as you point out, is certainly a factor in understanding this history. So maybe, I guess, what I'm really trying to say is introducing more of the recent historiography around structural racism to think about what's unique about your presentation, because in some ways this is a familiar story. At the same time, what I thought was really interesting in your piece was the family collective memory, because when we talk about collective memory, and there's so much literature around this, especially in the European historiography, it's mainly around much larger collectives than family, whether it's ethnic groups or class or even gender or national. They're scaled up to much larger entities. But with your pointing out that the family unit also carries within it a collective memory on a smaller scale, and what gives that smaller scale and family unit a distinctive collective identity and memory. And I think part of it has to do with listening to your generation after generation choices people made in your family. For example, your father happened to go to Iowa State, happened to go to Harvard. All these things, of course, were new for his generation, where college education was now becoming a marker of success and societal progression in their family. And it seems you chose to pursue an academic career. And I'm wondering how much of the interior family collective transmission of values and memories also mattered for that particular family's progression versus other families. And I thought that was what was really unique, because you highlight so much of the personal choices within the family that you might want to, maybe I'll push you to be creative, even to be audacious and put it out there that the family unit in its own collective development produce something of a history of its own that we can learn from independently of just thinking about American society or immigrant society, because that there's some literature on that already, and I think what you bring out is much more of a unique, distinctive what happens, these what looks like random choices that then become very that set up the opportunities for the generation to come within that family. I'm guessing Ralph was your father. Yeah, so these are very moving stories, and personal stories are always very moving. So yeah, I'd like maybe to bring to speak to that. For Kate's paper, this is really fascinating. Actually, the telecommunications history is one that we're starting to hear more of in other European historiographies and the radio. Today, we kind of live in this internet-connected world, and we forget how the battle over the airwaves was something of a very important cultural asset and marker of finding a place in society, a place in culture in the time period you're covering. And I think you follow some of the historiographical literature on this, which is that we already knew that there was a battle between WSM and the FCC, and that they were already that there's historians who have talked about this being a business strategy. But what I also heard in your paper that was really interesting was, and maybe this has been covered by other historians, I'm not sure, but the fans, right? The fan letters is really where you're not getting the politicized narrative around Opry, but a genuine sort of frustration and sense that their place in the culture is being crowded out by a new modern, urban, 70s, forward-looking culture. Now, President Carter is from Georgia, so I was wondering how that might have at all affected this debate. But it seems like he too was very much for liberalizing the airwaves, and this then is now having an impact on the sentiments of the fans who are listening to this station. And what I was really fascinated, and perhaps you could speak more to this, is these thousands of letters, what are they saying? And you sort of summarize, but I think it would be really interesting to hear the detailed phrases they use to actually express these sentiments. How do they identify what rural culture is? Right? We presume we're going to categorize it as rural culture, rural sentiment, Southern narrative, but what was it for them? Maybe they don't always see it as just Southern, but rather an American heritage. You point out, what are the connections they're making between the Southern musical heritage and American culture writ large? And why is canon, this Pearl, I remember this show, I remember Hee Haw, I remember all of that, and I just thought growing up as an Asian American looking at this, I was just like, I loved it. I thought, wait a minute, so that's what I associated with being Southern, which is actually not always the positive image. These are farmers in overalls, sort of displaying their kind of Hopi, almost redneck identity, hillbilliness, I should say, more than redneck. And so I thought, oh, they look actually proud of this. So what is it in this moment and these images that they're seeing that speaks so deeply to them? And is this the only kind of image they're fronting as one that they identify with as their Southern culture? So really fascinating studies here. I guess the connection is really American culture. What are the values that each sector of the subjects our historians have presented identify as being American culture, whether it be the taking babies from orphanages and rearing them for future citizens, which is like the scary part, eugenics and euthanics. Is it and we have here the immigrant culture of a Scottish family whose descendant now is before us, and that speaks to kind of the image that we had of the ideal American, and now as we're entering an America that is becoming ever more diverse, the debates around structural racism and the resistance to teaching structural racist theories in schools. How is now you're so well positioned to speak to the kind of shifts in the currents And obviously you are feeling the social conscience of bringing your family history as showing just how much privilege you had. But actually also, it's speaking to a time when these kinds of, what to our ears sound very race-centric, also produced someone who was a very progressive social conscience. So how does that work? And that's fascinating to me too, because the idea is to groom this white America, and yet here is white America also speaking to structural racist issues. And I thought maybe you could bring some wisdom to that for us. And yeah, I can go on, but I really learned a lot. Thank you so much for bringing these amazing papers to Bentley. And I'll let the audience maybe ask some questions, and maybe the speakers can speak to one another as well. Thank you so much. It's an honor.
Yes.
Let's go in order. Maybe this time Kate can come second, and please feel free to come join us. So Jennifer, if you have a few words to any comments, or maybe you can speak to one another. I'm letting the floor wide open. We have until 11:45, so we have plenty of time for all of us.
Well, I guess I just wanted to say this is a very pared down version of the paper I originally wrote, and also the one that I would like to write. This was specifically about practice babies, but I think it's really interesting as part of the larger home economics movement and what that meant for women and for their possibilities, and also for their limitations. The part you mentioned about eugenics is really, really, really important to this, because the idea is that we can create a better people. And that can be racialized, but and often was. But it was also, I know in a lot of HBCUs, they also had practice baby programs. Yeah, and they also had a home economics, their own sort of home economics tradition.
Are you going to talk about that?
I would like to.
Yeah, that's amazing.
And that was part of this concept of like racial uplift. Like, how can we create better people, more prosperous people? So it's sort of an example of a much larger movement and attitude, and sort of it's very a little bit frightening and foreign to us.
I hope you will publish it. Are you going to publish the paper?
I have no idea.
Oh, you should, absolutely. You should give it to your professor and say, I want to publish.
Yes.
It would be amazing.
Thank you.
I'm not even sure where to start.
Do you want to go next one?
You can go.
So I think all of us, by the speed in which we were trying to talk through our papers, we had a lot more in the papers and a lot more probably behind it. I'm fascinated with how these narratives on from the dominant historical narratives that leave out structural racism make their way into family histories, but also how those family histories and the retelling of them then reinforce the dominant narratives, and kind of see that over and over. And I think having individuals as examples are more compelling than putting up a definition of structural racism and being very academic about it. At least that's what I find. And as an educational psychologist, I can say I know there's reasons behind that theoretically. You brought up the interior family and how that might influence people's choices, and there certainly are a lot of examples of that. My father's mother and father left Montana after their parents' experiences there. My my dad was raised with a lot of structure, not so much somebody always watching what he's doing, but more what you had to do. He missed 22 and a half days of school total. 21 of those was scarlet fever when he was in first grade, a day and a half in high school. Didn't matter the weather, you go. He had to go to church every Sunday, and he ended up thinking that this was not the way to live. So he doesn't like to be told what to do, but he also wanted his children to think more broadly. He was really bothered by hypocrisy that he saw in the church as well as in society about equality and freedom. So I think I inherited some of that from him. Also, things like watching a business go like this. That's not something I really wanted to do. Academics seem to have a lot of freedom in it, but you got a steady paycheck. And I think people are fascinating. So psychology was great for that. And then, so there certainly are those links. I think there are also links about what was allowed for women, which I haven't had time to talk about, but Matey's experience being harnessed to the plow. There's definitely, issues of feminism, and that comes down through generations change as well. Something I think is really fascinating are things like, well, I love that you brought up eugenics, because my grandmother married my grandfather, the American one, because she wanted smart children. She said it didn't really work out that way. They were told that my father was a little dummy in third grade, never to expect much of him. But, so she said eugenics didn't really work. She thought it was more environmental. But how that changes over time and child rearing changes over time. And I'm really fascinated that all of us are really talking about American culture in ways, and you and I a lot about collective memory. How do we project that in nostalgia? So I thought that was really interesting as well. So many different things you gave me to unpack, and I'm going to stop and give her a chance.
Yeah, no, please, this is great. Yeah, so this paper comes out of a larger investigation of mine into identity formation, particularly around imagined communities and the ways that mass media technologies in the early 20th century sort of facilitated that in a way that had never been seen before. So radio, of course, was the first here, and the Opry, what is so fascinating to me about the Opry is that it really comes at like the height of this imagined community creation with such strong religious undertones.
Mm-hmm.
And so the first kind of imagined communities radio creates are religious communities because radio broadcasters, and it's in the early days, are religious leaders. And so I see this as being deeply tied to sort of radio's origin story in like radio evangelism and mass media marketing, because obviously there's so much marketing strategy that goes into evangelism, even in the early 20s. One of the points that I thought was really fascinating that you had brought up was, what are the listeners actually saying about how they envision their own histories, their identities in this sort of rural southern space, or rural space in general. And so I was able to go down to the Country Music Hall of Fame and read through hundreds of these letters. And surprisingly, most of them never brought that up. But a little bit after that, I forget what radio station released it, but a public radio station released the podcast Dolly Parton's America. I don't know if anyone here has listened to it. Fantastic, highly recommend. If you haven't, please do listen to it. And there's an episode in there where the host is interviewing Dolly Parton and asking her about, her role in creating this sort of identity for listeners, and also perpetuating this kind of hillbilly image. And she takes great offense to the term hillbilly. And having that be placed on her experiences, even though the experiences that she's writing and singing about and the way that she's presenting herself in and outside of Nashville are deeply rooted in what we in American culture might think of as like this hillbilly identity. And so a lot of listeners that were writing to the FCC kind of touched on some of these same points. obviously 40 years earlier than Dolly Parton was doing so, but I found that to be a really fascinating connection between like present and past over the same topic.
What do they say? Like, what are the words?
So they are mostly using, they're talking about the rurality of where they grew up, their towns, their hometowns specifically. They're using terms to describe their home places, and places where they, as youth or in their childhood, had gathered with family. And so listening to the Opry or tuning into WSM or radio in general becomes more about the experiences that you had while doing that and the memories that reminiscing on those experiences can evoke versus the actual act of doing it. So I found that to be really fascinating. They also throw around terms in these letters, country people, rural people. They never explain exactly what country people means. I mean, we can take a stab at it and put on our own definitions, but they identify as country people or rural people without really elaborating.